What if the woman you saved wasn't just running from danger, but from men who claimed they owned her? And what if standing by her side meant you'd have to choose between dying for a stranger or finally living for someone? This isn't just another frontier tale. This is the kind of love story that starts with blood silence and a loaded rifle and ends with something that could change everything. Stay to the end. You won't forget it. They used to say that nothing human could survive west of Yuma Ridge. Not faith, not forgiveness, not flesh. Out there in that desolate crescent of Colorado, the land itself seemed to rise against the living. But Colton Graves had managed. Not because he was stronger than the desert, but because he'd let the worst parts of himself die long ago. And sometimes that was what it took to endure. That morning, like countless before he woke, to the light pressing through the cracks of his cabin walls, not gentle light but brutal, unrelenting heat that painted everything in orange and ash. Outside, the air hung thick with dust. There was no breeze, no bird calls, only the stretch and groan of a land too tired to sing. Colton rubbed the sleep from his eyes and sat up on the edge of the cot. His back ached. His left leg throbbed from the old war wound that never quite healed, and the silence gnawed at him. But he welcomed it. Silence was honest. At 43, Colton had the build of a man carved out of oak, lean tall and weathered. His hands were rough, his beard streaked gray, and his eyes had seen too much and cared too little. The war had taken his brother. The government had taken his land, and the rest of the world had forgotten his name. So he made his way to the edge of nowhere and built a life that didn't require anyone's permission. He checked the traps. Empty, fed the mule, refilled the water trough. It was routine, the kind of mindless repetition that kept him grounded. He liked it that way. But that morning was different. As he turned the corner of the corral, he saw something out of place. A shape. Low to the ground. Still. Colton squinted. At first, he thought it was just discarded cloth or an animal curled under the fence post. But as he stepped closer, the shape took on a different meaning. Skin, a leg, a face, a woman. She lay collapsed in the dust like a broken doll, her body sunburned and shaking, her dress shredded and barely clinging to her thin frame. Blood had dried dark at her thigh and across her ribs. One foot was raw, blistered open. Her hair, long and black, clung to her skin in thick, tangled waves. Colton stopped in his tracks. Everything in him said to walk away, just walk. Let the wind take her. Let nature sort it out. This was Navajo land, and the politics of the region were dangerous. He didn't need the kind of trouble a bleeding woman brought with her. Soldiers' bounty men worse. But then she stirred. Her lips parted. Dry. Cracked. A breath caught in her throat. She was still alive. He stood there for what felt like an hour staring, heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. This wasn't a choice he wanted, but it was one that had already been made. "Damn it," he muttered and dropped to his knees. She was burning with fever, her skin hot to the touch. Her pulse weak. She'd been crawling maybe for miles. He scooped her up, cradling her like she might vanish if he wasn't careful. She was so light, scary light. Inside the cabin, he cleared the cot with one sweep of his arm. Tools and old blankets fell to the floor. He laid her down gently and just stared for a moment. She didn't wake, didn't move, just breathed. Then he got to work. Water boiled in a dented tin pot. Whiskey cheap biting splashed onto cloth. He peeled the dress from her thigh fingers, trembling. The wound had crusted over, but infection lingered. Her side was worse, jagged deep. A knife wound, he guessed. not fresh, maybe 4 days old. Someone had tried to kill her. She'd stopped them. He cleaned the gash as best he could, then sewed it closed, whispering nonsense the whole time. Words not meant for her to hear, just meant to fill the awful stillness. She flinched in her sleep. Twitched. Muttered sounds that weren't English. Names, maybe. Prayers. He didn't ask. By the time night crept over the land, she was stable. At least for now. Colton sat by the fire staring into the orange glow. He hadn't had company in 10 years. Not real company. And now this woman, this ghost of flesh and blood, lay dying on his bed. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she was running from. But he knew one thing as certain as the war that had gutted him. She didn't come here by accident. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every groan of the wind made him sit upright. Every shifting shadow made his fingers twitch toward his rifle. But he stayed awake watching. Not out of duty, not even out of fear, but because something inside him, something long buried, had started to stir. And for the first time in years, Colton Graves wasn't completely alone. Not anymore. Not ever again. The first sound she made was a gasp, soft, dry, fragile, as a leaf caught in wind. Colton heard it before he saw her eyes. He turned from the fire just in time to see her jolt, her hands fumbling for a knife that wasn't there. Her chest rose in panic. Her eyes were wide and sharp, dark as storm clouds, and filled with the kind of terror a man never forgets once he's seen it. Colton didn't move, didn't speak right away. He just sat there, elbows on his knees, letting her take him in, letting her decide what he was. "You're safe," he said. Finally, voice low and quiet as the wind outside. "You're in my home. I found you near the fence. You were bleeding." She didn't understand the words, or maybe she didn't trust them. Her body was still, but her eyes darted everywhere, door, window, his hands, searching, measuring. He poured a tin cup of water from the jug and held it out toward her. She stared at it like it might explode. After a moment, she reached. Their fingers touched, and he felt how small her hand was, how rough, how broken. She drank one sip at a time like it was a sacred act. Then she laid back again, her strength spent. He didn't press her. He didn't ask questions. He just sat silent. The next 2 days passed in a hush, as though the world had paused to breathe. She didn't speak. She watched him constantly, especially when he approached, but she didn't flinch. Her wounds began to close. Her fever broke. She ate what little he offered, beans, flatbread, bits of dried apple. On the third morning, she spoke. One word. Amaya. He looked over from where he was tying bundles of sage. She had pointed at herself. Her voice was hoarse, her lips cracked, but the word was clear. He nodded. Colton. She repeated it softly, then closed her eyes. That was all. They didn't talk much after that, but something shifted. She started sitting up on her own. She moved from cot to chair, even helped him grind corn with trembling fingers. She showed him, without words, how to brew a paste from willow bark to keep her fever at bay. She found sprigs of herbs outside the cabin and pressed them into his palm. Trust, it seemed, didn't always need language. Still, it wasn't easy. One afternoon she tried to stand and her leg gave out. Colton caught her just before she hit the floor. She struggled against him, fists weak but defiant. "Stop," he said gently. "You're not ready." She didn't answer, just looked away ashamed. He helped her back to the cot and covered her gently, careful not to disturb the wound. She lay still, breathing hard, her pride bruised worse than her body. That night she didn't sleep. Neither did he. She sat by the hearth, eyes fixed on the fire, while Colton carved kindling with an old blade. She was wrapped in a blanket, her silhouette still frail, but no longer fragile. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly, voice heavy with her accent but clear enough. He looked at her, shrugged. "Because you were breathing." She studied him for a long time, searching for lies, finding none. "You not afraid of you?" he asked. She didn't reply. He looked at the fire, afraid of losing more than I already have. Silence fell again, but it wasn't cold. Later, she helped him stir the morning pot. He showed her how to load a rifle, slowly, patiently. She learned quick, too quick. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breath stayed even. She had done this before. The next morning, she asked to help gather water. He hesitated, then nodded. He handed her the jug and walked beside her. The sun had just crept over the ridge, and the chill of night still lingered. She limped, but she made it to the stream. There, for the first time, she smiled, just a flicker. He saw it, and it stayed with him. They returned slowly, her leaning on him more for balance than weakness. Inside, she took over boiling the herbs. Her movements were precise, even elegant in their simplicity. She worked with quiet focus, and Colton found himself watching her more than he should have. As the sun dipped low, they sat on the porch together. The mule chewed quietly by the fence. A hawk circled overhead. "You from war?" she asked. He nodded. "Union Scout, Missouri, then Texas." "You kill?" He didn't answer at first, then said, "Too many." She nodded like she understood, not judging, just knowing. That evening, she fell asleep in the chair by the fire. Her head leaned slightly to the side, her breathing steady. He covered her with a blanket, then sat beside her, watching, guarding. In that moment, he realized something had changed. The silence of the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt shared, alive. They shared supper in silence. She reached for his hand once when she stood. He let her. And when he looked at her, really looked at the healing cuts, the calm behind her eyes, the way she carried herself. Now he didn't see a victim. He saw someone who had clawed her way back to life. And she had chosen to stay. And somehow, in choosing to stay, she'd given him a reason to as well. The first sign came with the dust, 3 faint trails in the hard earth just north of the ridge. Colton spotted them while checking his traps at dawn. They were boot prints, light but deliberate. One dragged at the heel, 2 walked, 1 rode. He knelt beside them, ran his fingers across the shallow indentations. These weren't wanderers. These were men with purpose, and they were close. When he returned to the cabin, Amaya was tending the fire. Her face had gained color, her posture straighter. She looked up the moment he stepped inside, reading the weight in his eyes before he said a word. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. He nodded. "Soon." She didn't ask how he knew. She just stood there for a long moment, then turned back to the fire, stoking the flame. Her movements were sharper now, less about survival and more about preparation. That evening, she told him the rest. She spoke slowly, piecing together broken English with a voice that never shook. Her words were flat, not from lack of feeling, but from too much of it. Her brother had been gunned down in front of her, her uncle beaten and left to die. 3 white men, traitors, bounty types, had tied her wrists with rawhide and dragged her behind a horse, saying she'd fetch a good price in the southern territories. They mocked her language, called her a commodity. She escaped on the 3rd night, rolled close to the fire, burned through the rope with the smoldering stick, and slit the throat of the youngest while he slept. She'd run ever since, on foot, through desert and canyon, no food, no name, no mercy. She lived on roots, drank from muddy streams, and hid in rock crevices like an animal until her body gave out. Colton didn't interrupt. When she finished, she looked at him, not to see if he believed her, but to see if he still respected her. He did, That night, neither of them slept. He loaded his rifle. She sharpened the old hatchet. Every movement was purposeful. He boarded the windows. She tied her hair back, exposing a neck lined with bruises still yellowing from old pain. They spoke little, but there was understanding in every glance. Before dawn, they stood outside and watched the sky change. She whispered something in Navajo, low and reverent, her words drifting like smoke. He turned to her. "We don't run." She nodded once. "We stand." Colton showed her where he'd buried extra ammunition. She showed him where to smear her herbal paste on the door to keep snakes away. It was survival shared in silence. The first rider arrived just after midday. Colton saw him from the hill, dust rising behind his horse. A second rider followed, and the third walked behind slower, like a man trying not to be seen. They stopped 100 yards from the cabin. Their body language was casual, but too casual, like a predator pretending not to stalk. One of them, a tall man in a long black coat, silver glinting from his belt buckle, stepped forward. "You've got something of ours," he called, voice like molasses laced with venom. Colton stepped onto the porch. His rifle hung easy in his hands. "She's not a thing. She's property," the man replied. "And you're harboring a fugitive." Amaya stood just behind the door, revolver steady in her grip. She didn't blink. The man laughed. "You gonna die over an Apache?" Colton didn't answer. The man reached for his belt. That's when Amaya fired. The sound cracked through the valley like thunder. The second man dropped from his horse's shoulder, burst wide. The horse reared, screamed, bolted. Colton fired next, catching the leader in the thigh. He collapsed, howling, clutching at the wound. The echo of gunfire hung heavy in the dry air. "Drop it," Colton said to the third man, who was now frozen in place. The man obeyed, slowly. The revolver hit the dust. Colton walked down the steps, rifle trained. He stood over the fallen man who glared up at him with red, hateful eyes. "She's not yours," Colton said. "She's worth money. That kind don't get to walk free. She's more free than you'll ever be." The man spat. "You don't know what you've started." Colton leaned closer. "You come back, I end it. Here, you understand me." He didn't wait for a reply, just walked back to the porch. Amaya hadn't moved. Her hands still gripped the revolver, her breath shallow. He stepped close, took the gun gently, and set it aside. "You're safe," he said. "I shot him." "Yes, and you lived." She didn't cry, but her knees buckled and he caught her, held her. That evening they sat inside as the fire burned low. The smell of smoke lingered on their skin. Neither spoke, but both knew something had changed. The world had turned a corner. Amaya finally whispered, "They will come back." Colton nodded. "Maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come." She touched his arm gently. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the sun dropped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the land. Shadows that didn't frighten them now. They had faced worse. And in that dimming light, for the first time since the storm began, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting, together. It began not with thunder, but with stillness, a kind of eerie, suffocating quiet that wrapped around the land like a warning. The wind had died sometime in the afternoon, and even the birds had gone silent. Colton sat on the porch, sharpening his blade, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone the only sound. He glanced toward the ridge more than once, his eyes narrowing at the faint line of dust drifting low across the horizon. Inside, Amaya was pacing slowly from wall to wall, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Her limp had lessened, but the old wound in her thigh still tugged with each step. She paused often to steady herself, then resumed, focused and deliberate. Her revolver was already holstered at her hip. The cabin, once a place of solitude and refuge, had become a fortress. They had spent the entire day reinforcing what they could, nailing fresh planks over the windows, stacking crates along the back wall, preparing water and powder. Every action was done in silence. Their minds focused, their breaths measured. There was no room for panic now. Only clarity. Resolve. Colton had been a soldier once. He'd seen blood spill for less than what he was protecting now. But even in his years of war, there was something different about this night. This wasn't a battle for politics or territory. This was something older, deeper. This was a stand for the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought and wouldn't be surrendered. He stepped inside to check the lantern, then looked to Amaya. She was sitting now by the hearth, fingers working a leather cord into a braid. Her eyes lifted to meet his, calm and unreadable. "They'll come after dark," she said. He nodded. "You sure?" She glanced toward the shuttered window. "It's how they work, like jackals, waiting for cover." He crossed the room and sat beside her. "We stay together," he said simply. "I know." They sat like that for a while, side by side with the fire low and quiet. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wood and sweat. Outside, the sky turned from blue to bruised purple. A single coyote howled far off. As the last light vanished, they heard it hoofbeats. Slow, steady, confident. Colton moved to the window and peeked through the narrow slit between the boards. 2 riders, just as before. But this time, they didn't stop at the edge of the property. They came forward, reins loose, rifles across their backs. Lantern light flickered from one saddle. Behind him, Amaya rose and took position near the back door. She didn't shake, didn't breathe heavy. Her eyes were sharp and ready. The riders stopped 20 feet from the porch. One of them dismounted slowly, a silhouette of broad shoulders and a long coat. The other stayed mounted, hand near his weapon. Colton stepped outside, rifle in hand. "Evening," the man said, voice too calm. "We talked before." Colton didn't respond. "We gave you a chance to do this quiet. Now we're here to collect. She's not going anywhere." The man chuckled, pulling a small flask from his coat. "You know what I think? I think you don't know how close you are to dying," Colton said evenly. The man's hand twitched toward his belt. Inside the cabin, the back window creaked. Then it all happened at once. Amaya fired from the side window, her shot cracking the air like lightning. The rider on horseback jolted, slumped forward and fell. His horse reared and bolted. Colton didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee and fired toward the man on the ground, striking him clean in the chest. The body fell with a dull thud. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm clouds now rolling overhead. Colton rose slowly, rifle still, aimed, eyes scanning. Nothing moved. He turned back inside. Amaya was standing near the doorway, revolver held low, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. "You hit him?" he asked. She nodded, didn't think, just aimed. "You did good." She exhaled a long, shuddering breath. Then her knees gave out, and Colton caught her before she hit the floor. He carried her back to the cot and sat with her while she trembled. Not from fear, but from something deeper, release maybe. The terrible relief of surviving the moment you feared would end you. Later that night, Colton returned to the front porch. The 2 bodies remained where they fell, silhouetted against the moonlight. He would bury them in the morning, or perhaps leave them for the vultures. He hadn't decided yet. Inside, Amaya had fallen asleep at last. Her face turned toward the fire, mouth parted slightly, hand still resting on the grip of her pistol. Colton sat and watched her breathe. Her presence filled the cabin now, not like a guest, but like someone who belonged. When the wind finally returned just before dawn, it carried with it a strange, new calm, the kind that only follows after something has been broken and rebuilt. It moved through the trees around the stones, through the cracks in the old cabin walls, whispering a different kind of silence now. One that felt earned. Colton closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of what had passed and what hadn't. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, maybe more men, maybe worse. But they had drawn their line, and they hadn't backed down. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man hiding from the world. He felt like a man defending it. And as the first light of morning crept over the horizon, he rose from the chair, walked to the door, and bolted it shut, not in fear, but in peace, because the storm had come, and they were still standing. The days that followed the storm came heavy with silence, not the hollow kind that used to haunt Colton's life, but one filled with a sense of breath held in reverence. Amaya slept long into the morning. After the fight, her body curled beneath the blanket, one hand resting over her ribs, the revolver never far from reach. Colton watched her sleep, the faint twitch of her brow, the subtle rhythm of breath. She was alive, and so was he. But more than that, they were still here. By noon, the bodies were gone. Colton had dragged them out past the ridge, buried them shallow beneath the cottonwoods. He didn't mark the graves. There was no need. Some things were better left unnamed. Amaya stood at a distance while he worked, wrapped in a shawl, her hair pulled back tight. She didn't speak until they were walking home. I thought I wouldn't feel anything she said. But I did. He glanced at her. What relief, not joy, not anger, just peace. Colton nodded slowly. He understood that feeling. Too well. Life at the cabin shifted after that, subtly but permanently. The air felt less thick with waiting. The chores came easier. Amaya moved more confidently now, her limp nearly gone. She returned to the garden they had started weeks ago, pulling weeds, planting beans. She even laughed once, startled by a rabbit that darted between her feet. Colton heard that laugh from inside and froze mid-step, like it was something fragile he might break if he moved too fast. He started talking more just in passing, pointing out clouds that meant rain, telling her how to spot bad timber. And in return she spoke of her home, what little of it she remembered. Her mother had died of fever when she was 6. Her uncle had raised her like a warrior. Her brother had taught her to climb trees and never apologize for being faster than the boys. One morning, while tending the water trough, Colton looked up and found her standing still, hand over her stomach. Her face unreadable. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, then hesitated. "I miss bleeding." His gut clenched. "How long?" 2 moons, she said quietly. They didn't speak of it again that day, but later, while sitting on the porch, she leaned into him, her fingers brushing his. "If it's true," she whispered, "then I want it to be here, not anywhere else." Colton didn't answer with words. He just wrapped an arm around her shoulder and held her as the wind picked up. Spring softened the land in ways Colton hadn't seen in years. Wildflowers bloomed at the edge of the bluff. Bees returned to the tree hollow near the creek. Even the mule seemed less irritable. Amaya stitched new cloth into her old dress, her belly beginning to show. They began building a second room, a proper space for the child to come. One evening, 3 shadows approached from the southern path, figures on foot, their posture calm, unthreatening. Colton tensed until Amaya stepped forward, breath catching. "It's them," she whispered. "My people." The eldest among them, a man with braids like silver rope and a necklace of bone, spoke first. "We heard stories," he said, in Navajo, that a woman fled the south, that she lived. Amaya nodded. "I did." He looked at Colton, then back to her. "You were saved by him." She nodded again. "Then, by our law, you belong with him if you choose." Amaya looked to Colton, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. "I choose." They stayed the night speaking in hushed tones, sharing bread and stories. Before leaving at dawn, they gave her a bundle of herbs, a carved wooden rattle, and a name. For the child, the elder said, "If it is a girl, Alona. It means strong as the sun." Amaya whispered the name to herself long after they'd gone. By summer, the second room was finished. The cabin looked different now, less like a shelter and more like a home. Amaya's belly was full and round. She moved slowly but with purpose. Colton never strayed far. He'd chop wood, then rest beside her. They spent evenings in quiet companionship, watching dusk settle like a soft blanket across the land. When the baby came, it was just the two of them. The labor was long. Amaya didn't scream, but she gripped his hand so tightly he thought his bones might crack. And then, as the stars burned bright above the cabin roof, the child arrived, red, strong, and wailing. Colton wrapped her in a towel, his hands trembling. Amaya took the baby and held her close to her chest. "She's ours," she said, tears in her eyes. They named her Alona. The weeks that followed were slow, filled with soft sounds, the coo of the baby, the creak of the rocking chair, the hush of wind through open windows. Colton made a cradle from pine. Amaya sang lullabies in a language he didn't know but never wanted to forget. One evening, as the baby slept and the sun dipped low, Colton looked at the woman beside him. Her face lined with strength, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We made it," he said softly. Amaya leaned her head on his shoulder. "No," she whispered. "We started." And that was the truth of it. They hadn't just survived. They had built something real, something strong, a place called home. Looking back over Colton and Amaya's journey is like tracing the path of a river that began as a dry crack in the earth, lonely, forgotten, lifeless, and eventually carved out a place where life could grow. What started as an accidental meeting at the edge of survival grew into a testament of healing, courage, and love. From the moment Colton carried her broken body into his cabin to the night she chose to stand by him with a gun in her hand, theirs was never just a story about survival. It was about transformation. Colton Graves, once a shadow of a man who'd spent years running from the ghosts of war and the ruins of trust, found something unexpected in the woman he nursed back to life. In helping Amaya find her strength again, he found pieces of himself long buried. He went from surviving each day in silence to living each day with purpose. Amaya, stolen from her people, dragged through cruelty and left for dead, refused to surrender her spirit. She didn't just escape. She reclaimed. They fought battles with more than bullets. They fought fear. They fought shame. They fought the temptation to retreat back into loneliness. And in each moment shared meals, quiet glances, tending a wound, listening to a story they built, something no storm or outlaw could undo. Their love was not sudden. It was carved, slowly shaped by fire and patience. And when their child was born, it wasn't just a symbol of new life. It was proof that their pasts no longer owned them, that from pain something beautiful could grow. The world outside their cabin didn't stop being dangerous. There were still men who believed women like Amaya were property. Still laws that favored the powerful and punished the innocent. But they had drawn their line, and they had held it, together. Colton's cabin, once a place of hiding, became a place of belonging, a home, not just for them, but for something more, for dignity, for peace, for legacy. And in that transformation they discovered a universal truth. Real strength isn't found in solitude, it's found in shared vulnerability. The lesson we take from this story is both simple and profound. Life doesn't give you peace. You make it. Peace is a choice, a daily deliberate act. Sometimes that means standing your ground when it would be easier to run. Sometimes it means reaching out a hand even when you're not sure if it'll be accepted. Sometimes it means loving someone who has every reason not to trust anyone ever again, and proving to them slowly and consistently that you're different. In today's world, so many people carry invisible wounds: trauma, loss, betrayal. We build walls around our hearts. We keep to ourselves. We stop believing that healing is possible. But this story reminds us that healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when two broken people decide to stop being broken. It happens in small, quiet acts of kindness and patience. It happens when we choose not to give up on each other even when the world tells us it's easier to look away. Amaya's courage didn't come from guns or escape. It came from choosing to stay when she had every reason to keep running. And Colton's redemption didn't come from one heroic act. It came from all the quiet ones tending wounds, making space, showing up every day. They didn't just survive together. They learned how to live again. You don't need a cabin in the wilderness or a war to teach you that. You only need to be willing to stay to show up for someone even when it's hard. You only need to remember that kindness, patience, and presence are stronger than fear. That loving someone through their pain is one of the bravest things you can do. So, if you take anything from this story, let it be this: even after the worst fires, something can grow. Even in the quietest hearts, love can bloom again. And even the loneliest place on earth can become home if you're brave enough to build it. We all deserve that. We all can choose that. Let this story be a mirror reflecting not just the grit of the Old West, but the enduring strength in all of us. Because every act of kindness, every moment of grace, builds a bridge back to the parts of us that still believe in love and redemption and in second chances. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it moved you, if it made you feel something real, hope, sorrow, strength, please support us by subscribing to our channel. It helps us keep telling these powerful stories from the American frontier. Stories that deserve to be heard. Stories like Colton and Amaya's that remind us how far a little faith and a lot of heart can carry us. Stay with us. There's more to come. Wild West legends, because every story is a legend.